Thank you everyone who's joined here early, and I'm just going to kick things off. This is Mishnah in Depth, Masachet Bava Metzia, where we have the pleasure of learning with Dr. Rachel Furst today. This class is a project of Drisha's Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is sponsored in her memory by her family. This class is a weekly accompaniment to the daily study of Mishnah Yomit. We are assuming that you've covered 1 to 2 mishnayot each day, and this is a supplemental shiur where you can learn with a community of fellow learners. Dr. Rachel Furst is a scholar of Jewish law and Jewish history with a focus on Jewish-Christian relations in medieval Europe and women and gender. She is currently teaching at Ben Gurion University and David Yellen's Teachers College in Israel, as well as at Paideia Institute of Jewish Studies in Sweden. And with that, I'd like to hand things over to Dr. Furst for today's class.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and welcome back to everyone who joined us for the first class last week, and welcome to anyone who might be joining us for the first time. As Kayla mentioned, this series, which is focusing specifically on the mishnayot of Tractate Bava Metzia, is going to be running for the next, 8 weeks in total, so for the next 7 weeks from now. And that will give us an opportunity really to study all of the mishnayot of that tractate. Although, as Kayla mentioned, this class is really designed for people who are studying Mishnah Yomit. Mishnah Yomit is a schedule whereby people study 2 mishnayot on a daily basis. So that every week, every Sunday, we're going to be examining in a bit more depth or expanding upon the study of the mishnayot that you, in theory, covered in the previous week. Of course, everybody's welcome. Even if you haven't studied the mishnayot in advance, you're more than welcome to join the class, and I hope that you'll get something out of it. But it is specifically designed for people who have learned those mishnayot in advance. So just to make that clear, you can find online, or Drisha can perhaps provide a calendar of the Mishnah Yomit, the standard Mishnah Yomit schedule that we're following. But just for example, this past Monday, September 16th, is the day that we and anyone who's following this calendar officially began studying the mishnayot, finished the mishnayot, studied the very last Mishnah of Tractate Bava Kama, which was the previous tractate, and began the first Mishnah of Tractate Bava Metzia. Today, September 22nd, those who are following the schedule will already be up to Tractate Bava Metzia, Chapter 2, Mishnayot 4 to 5. So today's class is going to be looking backwards and focusing primarily on a sort of review and in-depth dive into the mishnayot of chapter 1 of Bava Metzia, and the very beginning mishnayot of chapter 2. We'll continue with chapter 2 and chapter 3 next week in accordance with the learning schedule. And I see that Kayla just posted. Thank you very much.
Yep,
Kayla
I just posted. There are many online calendars that will generate the Mishnah Yomit schedule. I have posted the one that I personally use in chat.
Great, thank you very much. You can study the mishnayot, you can review the mishnayot yourselves using really any standard edition of Mishnah, and there are many things that are available online as well. A very easy one, for example, is the Sefaria site, which has the mishnayot in Hebrew and in English translation. As a matter of fact, on my PowerPoint slides, I'm using the translation that has been provided by Sefaria, which is drawn from the Steinsaltz Koren edition. So that's a very easily accessible one, but you're welcome to use really any version. We won't be going through each one of the mishnayot of the previous week in detail. We don't have time for that in our Sunday class, but we're going to be doing some kind of overview. Just out of curiosity, and again, completely and totally fine. You are very welcome if you have not studied the Mishnayot of this past week, but I'm just curious of those who are in attendance now, if there are those of you who have or who hope to in the coming week review the Mishnayot go through the Mishnayot on your own. Excellent. Okay, so that helps me just in terms of gauging. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, great. Okay, and just to reiterate what Kayla said as well, I'm going to be using PowerPoint slides in the context of our weekly classes, and I will provide them to Kayla, who will provide them to you immediately after class as a PDF, so that you'll be able to have all of the sources that we review together available to you afterwards. Nathan, I think that you have a question. No, you were just showing me that you are, okay, great. Sorry for misunderstanding that hand. Okay, if there are any questions, you should feel free, as Kayla said, to unmute yourself and to jump in. Okay, so with that, let's begin. I'm going to share my PowerPoint for today with you. I don't know how many of you were in attendance last week. Last week, which was, again, sort of the prelude to this course, insofar as the schedule had not officially begun to focus on the mishnayot of Bava Metzia, we began with an overview of the tractate, and also in particular, a discussion of the ways in which tractate Bava Metzia is very intimately connected with the tractate that precedes it in the 6 Orders of Mishnah, and that is Tractate Bava Kama, as well as with the tractate that follows it, Tractate Bava Batra. We spoke about the fact that it seems originally these 3 tractates were co-joined. They formed part of one larger tractate known as Tractate Nizikin, right? The entire order that we're located in, that these tractates are found within, is called the Order of Nizikin. But there also originally seems to have been a Tractate Nizikin, and that was one very enormous tractate that started off the order, that must have contained something like 30 chapters of Mishnah, which it seems like at some point the rabbis decided to subdivide. And here I'm just going to share my screen with you. One moment. Sorry, bear with me for 1 second, please. Okay, here we go. We spoke last week about different ways that this larger block of mishnayot could be subdivided. Again, you see up here at the beginning the way that ultimately the rabbis decided to subdivide them into these 3 distinct tractates, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, each one comprising 10 chapters of Mishnah. But I also pointed out last week that these 3 tractates that we have today, this original big Tractate Nizikin, could easily have been divided in a different manner into 5 equal units of 6 chapters each. And according to that division, what you see in the table before you, what we discussed last week, is that it makes it seem like the division into Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra was fairly arbitrary, because thematically, the opening chapters, the first 2 chapters of Bava Metzia, which are our chapters, actually follow thematically much closer. They fit much closer with the last 4 chapters of Bava Kama than they do with the remainder of the chapters of Bava Metzia itself. Now, last week, we took a look at Maimonides' commentary on the Mishnah, and it seems like Maimonides himself seems to indicate in that commentary that he thought the tripartite division, the division of Nizikin into Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, was a pretty early division, probably overseen by Rabbi Judah the Prince, by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who we credit as being the author or editor of the Mishnayot, probably overseen by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi himself. Nonetheless, I want to note today that Maimonides himself also, or simultaneously, recognizes and gives expression to the very intimate connection between the beginning of Bava Metzia and the conclusion of Bava Kama, insofar as in another major work of Maimonides' famous Mishneh Torah, his famous Code of Jewish Law, where he provides a sort of comprehensive overview of all of Jewish law up until his day, subdivided into these 14 books that you see in front of you, which is why Mishneh Torah of Maimonides is also sometimes known as Yad HaChazakah, Yad, the Hebrew letters Yud Dalid, also being an indicator of 14, representing the number 14. In any event, what I want to point out to you here is that Maimonides, within the 11th book, which you see here is Sefer Nezikin, the Book of Damages, right? Again, Maimonides very clearly organizes these laws differently than the Mishnah did. The Mishnah divided Jewish law into 6 orders and subdivided the 6 orders into tractates. Maimonides divided Jewish law into 14 books and subdivided each one of the 14 books into individual halach or sub-books, I guess you could say, and halachot. And he includes in Sefer Nezikin a section which he called Gizela ve'aveda. This is the one that's boxed in red. Gizela ve'aveda, which literally means robbery and lost property. Now, I said beforehand that this is an indication that Maimonides saw and appreciated the intimate connection between the end of Bava Kama, the last chapters of which deal with robbery, and Bava Metzia, the opening chapters of which deal with avedot, or lost property, right? The fact that Maimonides included these two within the same section, he titled his section Gezela ve'aveda, demonstrates that he really saw them as being part of one larger topic, again, that kind of spans these two tractates. Again, sort of by way of concluding last week's discussion, I want to also note that this point is made by other commentators as well. For example, the Tosafot at the beginning of Tractate Bava Metzia ask why Bava Metzia begins with what we know as chapter 1, Mishnah 1. That is, for those of you who recall, Shnayim ochazin b'talit, 2 people come to court holding a garment, etc., as opposed to beginning the tractate with the first Mishnah of chapter 2, or with all of the mishnayot of chapter 2. Chapter 2, as we'll discuss later today and next week, actually deals with many more fundamental principles of lost property than chapter 1 does. So it would seem to make more sense to start the tractate with chapter 2, with the mishnayot of chapter 2, and then move on to the mishnayot of chapter 1, which deal with kind of more nitty-gritty, more detailed laws of lost property. And Tosafot's answer is that the editors of the Mishnah chose to start the tractate specifically with our first Mishnah, Shnayim ochazin b'talit, 2 people who come to court holding a garment, because in our Mishnah, the focus is on how to divide property that is in doubt by means of an oath. And that topic was precisely the topic of the very last Mishnah of Tractate Bava Kama. So in order to underscore the close connection between these two tractates, to bridge the subject matter between these two tractates, the editor decided to begin Bava Metzia specifically with our first Mishnah. And the Rush says something very similar. Another one of the medieval commentators, he suggests that because in our first Mishnah, we're talking about a case, the dispute can be understood to stem from some sort of suspicion that one of the 2 disputants stole the object. So there's a suspicion of robbery. This again serves as a bridge back to the end of Bava Kama, which dealt with issues of robbery. So the point is that very many of the classic commentators really appreciated and wanted to underscore the connection between these 2 tractates. Now, today I wanted to point out that actually this connection between, I mean, it sounds a little bit bizarre, right? What's the connection between robbery and lost property? Between Gizela and Aveda. And I want to point out today that actually the verses of the Torah itself the verses of the Torah that we saw last week, as and we'll see additionally today, they also seem to underscore this connection. Last week, we took a look at these two main sources in the Torah for the laws of lost property. We spoke a little bit about the distinction between these two sources, one in Exodus and one in Deuteronomy. Today, I want to add the two primary sources for the Torah's prohibition to rob another. Those being Leviticus 19, which says, as you see here before you, lo ta'ashok et re'echa velo tigzol, etc., etc. You shouldn't defraud your fellow Israelite, and you should not commit robbery. And similarly, Leviticus Vayikra chapter 5, when one has thus sinned and realizing guilt would restore either that which was gotten through robbery or fraud, or the entrusted deposit, or the lost thing that was found. This verse goes on. It's in the middle of a thought, so that's why this verse doesn't seem like a full sentence. It's not. But critically, you can see that what the verse is underscoring is v'hashiv et hagzela, that one is obligated, if one robs a fellow, one is obligated to return the item that has been robbed. Right, that v'hashiv should remind us, it sounds very similar, and it is in fact very similar to what the Torah underscores with regards to lost property, that you are obligated to try and find the rightful owner, the original owner, and return the item. Now, by the way, you might be asking yourself, what does that mean? If you rob somebody, all you're obligated to do is return the lost item? I mean, doesn't sound like much of a punishment for what we think of as a pretty severe crime. And here I'm just going to remind those of you who studied Tractate Bava Kama that Bava Kama talks about the difference between gizela, or robbery, which is what we were talking about here. Robbery is theft that is committed openly, violently, in the light of day, as compared to gineva, which is another type of theft. Some people translate gineva as theft as opposed to gizela, which is robbery. And that refers to stealing something in a secretive or hidden manner. Interestingly, the Torah, in the case of gizela, of robbery, again, done in the open, violently, in the light of day, in that case, the Torah seems to require mainly to return the item, as compared to gineva, thefts done stealthily in the dark of the night, in a hidden manner, where the Torah imposes all kinds of penalties. Obviously, the person is supposed to return the item, the thief is supposed to return the item, but the Torah additionally imposes all sorts of penalties on the thief. The thief has to return either double the value of the item, or in some cases, even 4 and 5 times the value of the item. I'm not going to go deeply now into the logic behind these two different approaches to different types of theft. That was, again, one of the primary subjects of the end of Tractate Bava Kama. But I wanted to point out here to you, again, that the verses themselves, with regards to gizela, or robbery, sound strikingly similar, again, particularly Leviticus 5, to the verses in the Torah that talk about returning lost items. And again, that underscores the close connection that the Torah and later the rabbis drew between these two seemingly disparate topics. Before we leave these biblical verses, I want to briefly focus our attention a little bit further on the way that they serve as a source for the mishnayot that we're going to be focusing on today. That is the mishnayot of chapter 1 of Bava Metzia. And more specifically, I want to hone in on the verses in Deuteronomy 22. So this is the second group of verses. It's Dvarim Kaf Bet.
Dr. Furst?
Yes, please.
Just before you go on. So for Geneva, there is a penalty where you need to give more than the value. for gazela, it's really just returning it? Is there
That's
any
what,
punishment for the violence?
yeah, so that's what the Bible, I mean, very clearly, right? As we can see here in these two verses from Leviticus, the Bible very clearly prohibits robbery, right? But as far as the punishment that the Bible prescribes, the Bible says you have to return it, right? The Bible does
About
not
that
prescribe a
multiple.
penalty above and beyond returning the item. Again, very interesting discussion that we could have about the difference between robbery and theft. Why is robbery committed in the broad daylight, in the open? We can think of it sort of as like, mugging someone, or, gangsters kind of openly flaunting their authority and control of the hood by stealing something in broad daylight. Why is that seemingly less bad, I don't know, than thievery, which imposes this kind of penalty? Again, very interesting discussion that we're not going to get into
But
now
for
because
another
it's not a subject of our mishnayot. But I do encourage you to take a look again at the mishnayot in the last several chapters of Bava Kama, which deal with that question. Okay. Again, now, as I said, what I'd like to hone in on are these verses from Deuteronomy 22, which are one of the primary sources for the laws of lost property. So we're moving away from stolen property to lost property, and I want to pay attention to the expression of these biblical verses so that we can appreciate the way in which they really underlie the mishnayot themselves. So Devarim Kaf Bet, Deuteronomy 22 says, if you see your fellow Israelites' ox or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your peer. If your fellow Israelite does not live near you, or you do not know who the owner is, you shall bring it home, and it shall remain with you until your peer claims it. Then you shall give it back. You shall do the same with that person's ass. You shall do the same with that person's garment. And so too, you shall do with anything that your fellow Israelite loses and you find. You must not remain indifferent. Now, we noted last week that here the focus is on someone who is your fellow who has lost property. The obligation seems to stem from this fellowship, from this connection that you have with the person. And that contrasts with Exodus, which talks specifically about an enemy losing an object, and you as the finder bearing the very same obligation. What are the specific examples that the Torah brings here of lost objects in Deuteronomy 22? What examples do we have here of items that have been lost?
They bring animals, lost animals, clothing.
Okay, so the Torah very famously opens up with the sheep or the ox, animals, as you said, but I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Evelyn. You started talking about other examples that the Torah cites.
It just talks about garments.
Garments, right? So the Torah first talks about animals or animate objects, and then the Torah talks about garments, or that's perhaps a prime example of an inanimate object. Then the Torah goes on to universalize and to note, and so too shall you do with anything your fellow Israelite loses, right? The Hebrew makes that very clear. If you take a look at the verses in the Hebrew, the Torah says, "V'chein ta'aseh l'chol avedat achicha," right? Anything that your fellow might lose. Now, why do you think the Torah begins with animals? Why is animals, right? And if you just glance up at the verses from Exodus, the verses from Shemot actually talk only explicitly about animals. Why are animals the Torah's prime example of a lost object?
Because animals can wander off on their own.
Because animals are very easy to lose, right? Because they can wander off on their own. And if you remember the story about King Shaul, right, one of the classic stories of lost items in Tanakh, right? The whole story of Shaul being appointed king begins with Shaul wandering around with the servant in search of his father's atonot, of his father's donkeys, right? And the Navi tells us, this is in the first book of Shmuel, chapter 9, the Navi tells us that they wandered really far. They wandered all the way through Har Ephraim, all of Eretz Binyamin. In fact, they wandered so far that at certain point Shaul got nervous that his father would be more concerned about them than about the animals that had gotten lost. And then ultimately they end up seeking out Shmuel, who tells Shaul that he has been appointed king. The point is, again, that this classic case of lost items are about animals, because exactly as Evelyn pointed out, animals lose themselves very easily, right? Animals are liable to wander off. Inanimate objects obviously get lost frequently also, but they're not so easy to lose, perhaps, as animals. And we'll see next week when we talk about different types of guardianship, that sense of animals as being particularly easy to lose is reflected in the laws of guardianship as well, but I'll leave that for next week. Right, and then again, as we said, the Torah goes on to extrapolate to all lost items. Those examples, if you think about the mishnayot that we have studied this week, those examples are reflected precisely in the Mishnah. I'm going to pause here for just a moment. Lisa, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm just wondering if the verse in Shmot that you have to return your enemy's ox or ass, is that meant to be reciprocal? Is that so that they return yours?
So that's a really good question. I mean, it might serve that function, or of, perhaps doing a good deed for your enemy so as to break that whole category of enemy. But and again, we spoke a little bit about this last week. I think what the Torah is underscoring here is that this is something that you are obligated to do really regardless of who the person is, right? It's not a good deed that you're doing for someone because you owe them something, or because you want to curry favor with them. This is just a very basic universal moral obligation that you bear regardless of who the person is, friend or foe. Yeah. In any event, just to go back to what I was saying a moment
I have a
ago.
question.
Yes, please.
So since the first pasuk in Shmot, Chaf Gimel,
I'm going to ask you just
here,
pause for. Can you just pause for one moment? I apologize. It just began to rain here, and I can't hear. I have to close the window. My apologies. 1 second. Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, so the pasuk that you should return the animal that belongs to your enemy doesn't mention anything besides animals. So is it restricted to animals that you have to return?
Okay, that's a good question. The basic answer is no. The Torah there is again using animals because, as we said, animals are the classic example of lost items. But I don't think I don't think the Torah means to distinguish between what you're obligated to return to your enemy and what you're obligated to return to your fellow. As Deuteronomy points out, you're obligated to return anything that gets lost for your fellow Israelite, again, friend or foe. Again, what the rabbis do is they compare these two verses, these two sources, I should say, and really end up extrapolating from one to the other and learning that all of the laws that apply to one apply to the other, and that Torah was really just underscoring here by talking about it in two different registers, let's say, friend and foe, that really this is an obligation independent. It's a moral imperative independent of who lost the item, of who the original owner was. You are obligated to try and return an item that has been lost by someone else. And again, as we said, our mishnayot in Tractate Bava Metzia are now sort of delving into the nitty-gritty of that. We pointed out last week that the Torah and the Mishnah speak on two very different registers. The Torah is talking is making these big, grandiose, you could even say, value statements about obligations, about moral imperatives, whereas the Mishnah, as we have seen, is dealing with I mean, at the beginning of the chapter, you could even ask, it's not even 100% clear, perhaps on first read, that the Mishnah is talking about lost property. It's talking about two people who are fighting about something that they found. The Mishnah is talking not in grandiose, sort of moral imperatives at all, but really about the nitty-gritty of daily mundane disputes that might arise when people find lost objects. And that, as we said last week, is kind of typical of the difference between the biblical approach versus the Mishnaic approach. The Bible very often talks in big moral or ethical imperatives, whereas the Mishnah really often focuses in on the mundane, the day-to-day, the sticky cases, the complicated cases, the fights that people have about the application of those principles. But again, I want to go back to the point that I was trying to make just a moment ago, which is that these different examples the Torah brings of classic lost objects are reflected in our mishnayot as well. Just to take a quick look at these opening mishnayot of Tractate Bava Metzia, as we pointed out a few minutes ago, the opening Mishnah talks about shnayim ochazin betalit, two people coming to court holding a garment, right? We know that garment. We just saw that garment in the verses of the Torah, right? Why does the Mishnah talk about people holding a garment, a talit in particular? Well, because that's what the Torah brought as one of the classic examples of lost items. The very next Mishnah, Mishnah Bet, talks about hayu shnayim rochavin al gabei behema. Right, this Mishnah is talking about two people who found an animal, and how do they deal with that animal? Disputed claims of ownership over that animal. Mishnah Gimel, Mishnah 3, also talks about these animals, right? And so the point is that the Mishnah it's not coincidental that the Mishnah is talking about garments versus animals. The Mishnah is very consciously using these examples because the Torah itself did so. Now, you might have noticed that in the Mishnah, the order of these classic cases is reverse, right? The Torah talks first about animals and then about garments, whereas the Mishnah talks first about garments and then about animals. So that's one difference between the two sources. What other difference do you notice?
A very big one that I've noticed is that these are talking about keeping that lost thing, not about returning it.
Exactly. The Torah's focus is on the obligation to return the lost item, whereas our Mishnah, at least the opening Mishnayot of Tractate Bava Metzia, are talking about cases where, again, these two people are fighting about who has ownership over this lost object. But the point is, we're talking about how to acquire a lost object, not about how to return a lost object. Now, I do want to note, I apologize. I see, Evelyn, that you have another question.
No, really, I was just going to make reference to the fact that even though we're bringing those two psukim, they don't seem to refer to the same situation, which is what was just mentioned.
Exactly. Or either they don't refer to the same situation, or their focus is very different, right? The Torah's focus is on returning the lost item, and the Mishnah's focus is on who gets to keep this lost item. Now, I do want to note that chapter 1 of Bava Metzia can actually be, there are 8 mishnayot in chapter 1 of Bava Metzia. It can actually be divided into 2 units. Now, I apologize that I wasn't able on my PowerPoint screen to get all of the Mishnayot of the Tractate with their translation onto a single screen. This would be an easier exercise if you were able to see all 8 of the Mishnayot on one page or one screen before you, but let's just scroll for a minute to make this point clear. Back to Mishnah 1, right? Mishnah 1, as we said, is about 2 people holding onto a garment. They're disputing. Each one of them says, I found it first, and how do they deal with this dispute between the 2 of them? The second Mishnah, as we said, is talking about 2 people who are riding on the back of an animal, or one person who's sitting on the animal, one person who's riding on the animal. And again, they're disputing who owns this animal. Again, this is presumably a lost animal. Each one of the finders is claiming that they are the sole owners of this animal. And the question is, how do they contend? How does Beit Din negotiate that dispute? The third Mishnah is about someone who's riding on an animal and sees a found object elsewhere and asks someone else to acquire it for them. Does the person lift it? Does the person not lift it? Again, who gets to keep the object if they dispute it afterwards? The fourth Mishnah of the chapter is talking about someone who sees a found item, a Metzia, and falls on it, right? In order to kind of like claim ownership, grabs it by falling on it and holding it. But didn't use one of the formal modes of acquisition, didn't lift it, just kind of fell on top of it. So the question is, is that sufficient? Who gets to keep this object? The Mishnah goes on to talk about someone who sees wild animals now, right, as compared to the shiur and the se, the ox or the sheep. Now we're talking about deer or birds, wild animals flying through their property. Can their property acquire these lost or ownerless items for them? The fifth Mishnah, I'm purposefully going quickly here just to give you a sense of the main topics. The fifth Mishnah talks about who owns these lost items, who acquires the lost items. And we're talking about cases in which a minor child found a lost item, or a slave or a maidservant or a married woman found a lost item. Who becomes the rightful owner of those lost items? Right? So again, we've moved now through mishnayot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Up until now, as was pointed out, each one of these mishnayot is dealing with who acquires or how to acquire a lost object, right? A lost as in ownerless, right? An ownerless object, or an object that can be presumed ownerless, has been found. New people want to acquire and claim this item. How does that work? Right? And in that regard, this first unit of the chapter really does deal with a subject that, as we said, is very distinct from the Torah's focus. The Torah is talking about returning the item, and the Mishnah is talking about acquiring this lost object. Very different focus. But I do want to point out that from here on in, we said there are 8 mishnayot in this chapter. So now we're talking about mishnayot 6, 7, and 8, the remaining 3 mishnayot of this chapter. They actually deal with cases that are perhaps a little closer to the Torah's vision of what to do with lost items. Mishnah 6, as you can see here, is talking about someone who finds shtarei chov, or promissory notes, meaning documents, right? The remainder of the mishnayot of this chapter talk about documents, focus on documents. And here, there's already a question as to whether the person who finds these lost documents is allowed to keep them or should keep them, or whether the person should in fact look for the owners and return these lost documents. Right? And it gets a little bit complicated because it has to do with whether these, again, if we're talking about promissory notes, whether they include property guarantees or they don't include property guarantees, et cetera, et cetera. The Mishnah 7 deals with someone who finds bills of divorce or bills of manumission of slaves or wills or gifts or receipts, right? Those, the Mishnah says, you're actually not supposed to return them to the presumed owner of these documents, because it's possible that they were written but not actually given, so that they never actually went into effect. And if you return them to the original owner can claim they went into effect, even though they didn't actually. And the final Mishnah of this chapter goes into an even more complicated case about bunches or bundles of documents. Now, let me ask you a question, right? And so in all of these cases, from Mishnah 6, 7, and 8, here we are talking about, we're raising the question as to whether the found objects should be kept or can be kept, or whether they should be returned to their original owners, which again is closer to, more complicated than the Torah's case, but certainly closer to the Torah's case than perhaps the mishnayot of that first unit. What do you think might be the difference between documents, where the Mishnah is deliberating about returning them or keeping them, and animals or garments, where it seems pretty obvious to the Mishnah that finders keepers? It's just a question of which finder gets to keep them. Yeah, Lisa?
Well, the one thing that jumps into my mind is are witnesses.
Okay.
So just whether the, the presence of witnesses on a particular document, which goes to whether or not it was really enacted or not, or partially enacted.
Okay, so you're assuming that documents have witnesses, whereas other kinds of objects don't necessarily, or presumably don't have witnesses.
Anything legal has witnesses.
Okay.
I think because it's a legal document, it has an effect depending on who you deliver it to, whereas returning an animal doesn't really have that effect. Like if there is a document, whether it's this manumission of slaves or a will, something is happening because of this document. There's a next step to it, kind of, that will be affected
so that
by
definitely
who you
is a
return it to.
difference. Yeah, thank you. That is definitely a difference between documents and other kinds of objects. But in terms of the Mishnah's focus, or the Mishnah's assumption that documents, again, except in these exceptional cases, documents should be returned, whereas the other kinds of items shouldn't be returned. Why? Right?
For
And I
one
think
thing,
one thing,
documents have names on them. You
okay.
know
So I
who
think,
had them, who gave them, who accepted them, or was supposed to accept them, or whatever.
yeah, I think the basic distinction that the Mishnah is making here is between items that are presumably identifiable, like documents, because they have names on them, as compared to items like animals, clothes, other kinds of inanimate or animate objects that aren't presumably, or aren't by definition identifiable. Now, the Mishnah is going to point out that it gets a little bit more complicated. First of all, as we've seen with regards to documents that do presumably have names in them or on them, right? We already saw, right? The mishnayot of our chapter already demonstrate that it's not so straightforward, right? It's more complicated than that in terms of ownership, or specifically of the obligation to return them. The Mishnayot of chapter 2 delve into all kinds of cases of inanimate objects, like food, for example, that might have different kinds of signs on them that function as an identifier strongly enough that, in fact, one is obligated to return them. One can't just claim ownership and assume that the original owners had given up on them. And by the way, here I just want to pause and note that, and this appears in, we spoke about this last week, this appears in one of the Mishnayot of the last chapter of Bava Kama. The Mishnah's assumption about why it is permissible for the finders to keep the animals, the garments or whatnot, has to do with the Mishnah's assumption that the original, because these items are so common and so unidentifiable, the original owners, upon realizing that the objects have been lost, will have what the Mishnah calls in Bava Kama yeush, or despair of ever being able to retrieve their items. And the minute that they despair of being able to retrieve the items that they have lost, those items legally become hefker, or ownerless. Once those items are legally ownerless, then whoever finds them has the right to keep them. Now, the Gemara goes, again, we already saw that the Mishnah complicates that story. The Gemara in the tractate goes deep into questions of when does this assumption apply? When doesn't the assumption apply? What kinds of marks are considered signs? What kind of marks aren't considered signs? So it's not all that straightforward, but that's the basic idea. So basically, again, just to sort of summarize in terms of the structure of the Mishnayot in this chapter, we saw that Mishnayot 1 and 2 talk about disputed ownership, right? When there's a dispute between two finders with regards to, again, their claims of new ownership over these objects that they have found. We saw that Mishnah 3 talks about how a Metzia, how a found object might get acquired technically. Again, do you have to lift it? Can you just fall on it? Et cetera, et cetera. Mishnah number 4, and I'll just quickly go back through them again, is a continuation of that theme. How does one acquire a lost object? How does a finder acquire a lost object? And as we saw, Mishnah 5 talks about who acquires a lost object, right? If someone, and the basic idea is that a minor child or a slave, right, they dine at the table of their parent or owner. In other words, their parent or owner provides for them, gives them all of their financial needs, gives them all of their sustenance, and therefore they legally own that which the child or the slave has acquired. That same rule does not apply to adult children. It does not apply to what's called an eved or shifcha ivri, right, who are basically indentured servants as opposed to slaves. It does not apply to a wife who has already been at least partially divorced, but that's the basic focus of that particular Mishnah. And as we said, the remainder of the Mishnayot in this chapter focus on when must a lost object in fact be returned, and when may it not or should it not be returned. What I'd like to do with the remainder of our time today is to hone in on the very first Mishnah of this chapter. Let me just flip forward to that. Okay, here we are back at Mishnah 1. This Mishnah is, again, as we said, not coincidentally, the first Mishnah of the tractate. It addresses what becomes one of the central topics in the tractate as a whole. And again, the editors of the Mishnah made these editorial decisions consciously, right? It's not coincidentally the first Mishnah. What do I mean by that? This Mishnah deals at heart with the question of what to do in cases of doubt, how to deal with disputed ownership that really arise from situations in which it's not clear who the owner of this object is. Now, again, we're talking about ownership, newly established ownership of a lost item, but basically what the nitty-gritty of what the Mishnah is dealing with here is cases of disputed ownership. Let's just read through it quickly. Shnayim ochazin b'talit, two people come to court holding a garment. Ze omer ani mitza'atia, v'ze omer ani mitzahatia, right? So each one of these litigants claims that they found the object, meaning they found the object first, and therefore own it. Ze omer kula sheli, v'ze omer kula sheli. Each one of them claims that the entire object, the whole thing, belongs to them. What does the Mishnah say we are to do? How are we to resolve this dispute? The Mishnah says, Ze yishava she'en lo ba pachot michatzia, v'ze yishava she'en lo ba pachot michatzia. Right, so each one of the litigants takes an oath that he or she does not have ownership of less than half of this object, and then they divide it. Now, just pause here for a moment, right? That's a kind of strange kind of oath, right? Each one of them is claiming that they own the entire object. Why are they taking an oath that they don't own less than half of it? Why not take an oath that they own the whole thing? That's what they're claiming. Now, by the way,
So
this
then
oath
you'd have at
taking,
least, you'd have at
just
least
one
one
moment. I just
person.
wanted to add that this oath taking, this is a sign that it's a clear indicator that we're talking about a religious legal system, right? Where an oath has some kind of weight, right? An oath in the name of God has some kinds of weight in terms of determining who the owner or who is actually going to acquire this property. But yes, Evelyn, I believe you began to explain why the oath would have been raised
It
in this
just
way.
seems that if it's going to be divided between the two litigants, the two people that are holding the garment, then each one has to testify that if he's going to get 50%, that he owned at least 50%.
Okay, although again, why wouldn't it match their claims? Each one of them is claiming, right? They're ultimately they're going to divide it 50-50, right? But each one is claiming that he owns the entire thing. So why take an oath that doesn't match the claim?
Well, if they both took an oath that they owned the whole thing, at least one of them would be lying. Would
Okay,
be
so
swearing.
again, let's assume we're talking about a case of a lost item that two people saw at the same time and grabbed at the same time. Now, they each might think that they're telling the truth, but ultimately, they can't both own the whole thing, right? They can't both have acquired the whole thing. Really, truly, if we care about truth, it must be that one of them glimpsed it or grabs it or acquired it even a split second before the other person. And when we're talking about an oath in the name of God, we don't want, right, the Torah and subsequently the rabbis were very, very concerned about false oaths, right? They weren't going to set up a situation where a false oath was inevitable. And if we ask both of these litigants to swear that they own the entire thing, then we're setting up a situation where somebody is taking an oath in vain, right? Somebody, right, is lying even if they don't mean to be doing so. And so the rabbis said, we want everybody to take an oath. And probably the reason they wanted people to take an oath was to impress upon them how serious these claims were. In other words, don't make a claim that you're not certain about, right? This is a serious claim. You have to actually take an oath to back it up. And as a matter of fact, in the rabbinic system of law, oaths were used not infrequently to determine cases that were in doubt otherwise. But they wanted to make sure that the oath wouldn't be a false oath. And so they constructed this way of articulating it. But ultimately, how does the Mishnah resolve the conflict? The Mishnah says yachloku, divided in half. Now that seems kind of intuitive, right? It seems like a pretty obvious way of resolving this case of doubt. We don't know who actually owns the object. So, okay, seems fair enough. We'll divide it between them. But in point of fact, this is not the only way that the rabbis suggested resolving cases of doubt, similar cases of disputed ownership. And if we take a look at a parallel source to our Mishnah, and I apologize that I don't have the English here. The source on the right-hand side is the Mishnah, the source on the left-hand side is the Tosefta, also from the very beginning of Tractate Bava Metzia. Perhaps we'll have opportunity a different week to talk about the relationship between the Mishnah and Tosefta, but for the moment, let's just say that the Tosefta is another compilation of Tanaitic law, so it's from a time period that is parallel to the Mishnah. It contains many parallel opinions to those found in the Mishnah, and also some contrasting ones. And very strikingly, the Tosefta here at the beginning of Tractate Bava Metzia talks about what seems like the same case, right? Shnayim ochazin betalit, two people who are grabbing onto and claiming ownership of one garment. But here the Tosefta digresses. Zenotel ad makom shetafus, v'zenotel ad makom shetafus. Right? In contrast to the Mishnah, which says, okay, how do we resolve this disputed ownership? Well, they'll each take an oath, and then yachloku, they'll divide the item in half, right? And by the way, if it would ruin the garment to cut it in half, what yachloku means is they'll sell the item and divide the money, divide the proceeds. But the Tosefta says something very different. The Tosefta says, no, that's not the way we're going to resolve this dispute. Instead, each one of them is going to get the amount of garment that they're actually holding on to. If they were literally holding it right in the middle, then they'll end up with 50-50. But if one of them was holding on to a quarter and one was holding on to 3/4 or some other combination, then that's how much each one of them will get. The Tosefta goes on to say, B'met dvarim amurim, which case are we talking about here? Bizman shahayu shnehem tofsin ba. We're talking about a case where each of them was literally physically holding onto the object. Aval im hayta biyado shel echad mehem, but if they weren't both physically holding onto the object, rather the object is now in the hands of one litigant, and the other litigant is simply disputing his claim or her claim, then says the Tosefta, hamotzi michavero alav hareaya, which means the burden of proof is on the one who is not physically holding onto the object. The one who wants to remove the object from the hands of his fellow will have to bring proof that it in fact belongs to him. Let's think about this for a moment. What fundamentally is different between the way the Mishnah recommends resolving this dispute and the way the Tosefta recommends resolving it?
There's no oath involved.
There's no oath involved. That's true. Yeah.
It seems the Tosefta is just talking about physical force almost. Whoever succeeded in grabbing the garment away from the other person ends up with it.
Okay. So in other words, right, it's about whoever grabbed more, whoever's holding on to more. In other words, the Tosefta seems to be saying, well, what's the role of the court here? What's the role of the what's the role of the Beit Din of the court? What's the role of the Beit Din of the court for the Mishnah? And the Beit Din is not explicitly invoked here, but it's clear that the Beit Din is in the background. What's the role of the Beit Din of the court for the Mishnah?
I would say fairness.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Fairness.
Fairness. In other words, the Beit Din, the court, is presumably overseeing this dispute and coming up with a way of resolving it that is fair, legal, right? As compared to the Tosefta, what's the role of the Beit Din for the Tosefta?
Just to pass the judgment, just to pass judgment.
Well, basically nothing, right? The Beit Din is basically saying, we're not going to get involved, right? Whoever's holding on to it, that's the person we're not going to get involved. One person's holding 50%, one holding person 50%, great. But if they're holding different amounts, we're not going to get involved. Just split it up the way that you grabbed onto it. Or again, right, the Beit Din says, in the event that one person's holding it, the other person disputes it, we're only going to get involved when you bring proofs, right? Otherwise, you didn't grab onto it fast enough, you didn't get it. Right, so these are two very different approaches, first of all, to the role of the Beit Din, to the role of the courts, and also to the courts, and also to this question of what to do in a case of disputed ownership. I just want to, our time is just about over for today, but I want to point briefly to the fact that the Mishnah, that the rabbis, that Chazal in general they recognize and they discuss other cases of disputed ownership with other principles for how to resolve them. And we're going to get to this Mishnah next week, but I want to preemptively point you to Mishnah Bava Metzia, chapter 3, Mishnah 3. Here we have a case where a person says to two individuals, I robbed one of you of 100 dinars, but I don't remember which one of you it was. I don't know who I took the money from. Or someone says, one of your fathers deposited 100 dinars with me, but I don't remember who it was. I don't remember whose father it was. right? So we have a case. So again, who is the owner, right? There's two people here who might be the owner of the stolen item or who might be the owner of this deposit. What do we do, right? They don't know because it was their father's business steal, right? Or their father is who is stolen from. And the thief or the debtor doesn't remember anymore, although they're admitting that they owe something, right? So what do we do? How do we resolve the situation? And the Mishnah here says he gives 100 dinars to this person and 100 dinars to that person, right? In other words, the robber or the debtor actually only owed a sum total of 100 dinars. But he admits that he's confused. He doesn't remember which person it belongs to. And the Mishnah rules, you got to give both of them this money. And the Mishnah says here, this is because there's no way to determine which of them is entitled to the money. And he admitted the obligation at his own initiative. Right? It's kind of, the Mishnah seems to be imposing a penalty on the robber or debtor, who again concedes his wrongdoing, and is obligating him to resolve this issue of disputed ownership, not by, right? The Mishnah could have said, divide it 50-50, right? Give this unclear money to 50% of it to the one guy, 50% of it to the other guy. That's not what the Mishnah says. Here, the Mishnah says you got to put out double the amount. And again, it seems to be because the person is conceding his own guilt, either for, again, for having robbed the person to begin with, or for having forgot who he borrowed the money from. And so he has to put it out twice. In the same chapter 3, Mishnah 4, the Mishnah talks about a case where two people deposited money with one person. This one deposited 100 dinars and that one deposited 200 dinars. Right? So there were 300 dinars that were deposited in total. And when they come to collect their deposit, this one says, my deposit was $200, and that one says, my deposit was $200, right? And the person who took the deposits, he remembers that one guy deposited 200 and one guy deposited 100. He just doesn't remember anymore who deposited what. And each one of them is claiming that they deposited the larger sum. So what do we do? And here, interestingly, Mishnah says the Beili gives 100 dinars to this one, 100 dinars to that one, and the rest, meaning the third 100, the contested money, will be placed in a safe place until Elijah comes, right? Which is kind of a way of saying, like, until we can resolve, like, bring very, very clear proof, is just going to sit there. Nobody's going to get it. That's the opinion of what we say the Tanakama, the first opinion in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi says, if that's the case, then what did the swindler lose, right? Meaning both of them are claiming they deposited the larger sum. Obviously, one of them is lying, right? One of them deposited 200, one of them deposited 100. They didn't both deposit 200. And if each one gets 100 and the third 100 just waits until Elijah comes, then the person who's lying didn't lose anything. They don't get penalized in any way. That's not fair. And so his opinion is, Hakol yehei munach ad sheyavo Eliyahu. Nobody's gonna get anything. It's all gonna just sit there until Elijah comes. The point is, right, and the Gemara actually brings, so now we have two additional kinds of cases, in which the Mishnah here provides very different ways, very different instructions or approaches for resolving the dispute. In the Gemara, there are another bunch of cases, for example, people who fight over the ownership of a boat, where the Gemara concludes, Kol de'alim gvar, right? The Beit Din doesn't get involved at all, and whoever, like the stronger person, whoever's toughest and can duke it out, he's the person who wins. He's the person who gets ownership of the property, which is, again, radically different than what we see in our Mishnah. The point is that the Mishnah here and all of these other sources are basically they're kind of comparing and playing with and trying to work out what are the factors that determine how we treat cases of doubt. How much should the Beit Din be involved or not involved? How do we determine ownership? How do we resolve claims, doubt, et cetera, et cetera? And as I said before, this is one of the primary topics that Tractate Bava Metzia deals with overall. So again, no coincidence that our tractate begins with this Mishnah. I'm going to end here for today. Apologize for the slight overtime. And again, as I said, Kayla will happily send out these sources for anybody who's interested after class is over. And I look forward to seeing all of you again next week.
Thank you everyone for joining. As mentioned, class will continue a piece next week, and the email with the sources will go out. And I do want to highlight one upcoming class. Next Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern US time, -4 UTC, is the annual Judith and one moment, that was not the name of class. The annual Rudolph Memorial Lecture will be this following Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern time. If you are able to join, I would strongly recommend it. It's with Rabbi Silber. And you can find out more at drisha.org/classes. I hope to see you all next week, and happy learning.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr.
Goodbye.
Furst. Thank you, Jim.